people get real stressed around the choices they have with real estate. And Jane, I mean, you've covered real estate for many years, including Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Seattle Magazine, and now with your book, Rent versus Own, coming out. This is a choice that a lot of people are having to make.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Where do you see where do you see the biggest crux of this decision starting?
Well, it's interesting. I should back it up and talk a little bit about when I actually got this book deal. When we were working on selling the book, you have a proposal, you talk to publishers, and one of the publishers said, I don't think anyone wants to read a book about rent versus own because people make an emotional decision to own, and they don't want to think about it. They're just going to go to a buyer book and learn the tools to buy and how to get a mortgage. And my feeling, and the publisher that I wound up working with, Chronicle Books, our feeling was that's not true anymore. People emotionally want to own, but they want to backstop that with financial education about whether they can really afford it. If
gain
they're really
confidence
prepared.
in their decision.
Right. And so there's the whole thing, a home isn't supposed to be an investment, but invariably people juice up how much they spend on a home because in the back of their mind, they do believe it is an investment. So I think that's in what the fellow said earlier today, in terms of the short sales and how people are thinking about their home. Once the home's going south, suddenly they're looking at losing money on an investment. But in a market where home prices were always rising, people didn't think as much about an investment because they just assumed it was always going to work out. So you need to kind of play with different sorts of tools when you make this decision. You need to understand how owning a home is going to affect your total financial picture. And you mentioned that earlier. And the way I would describe that is owning a home creates opportunity costs elsewhere in your life. If you are in a market that doesn't go up precipitously and you only stay a couple of years, you might actually owe when you move out because of the fees to sell. If you stay somewhere 3 years, it doesn't go up. You're looking at basically coming out worse than if you'd rented. But at the same time, you really want to be in a school district. You're going to stay a while.
Paint a wall.
Right. So but you need to understand the sort of the nuances that you can actually lose money owning. It still might be worth it to you, but you need to understand how to do some of the math.
And that math piece is huge, especially because it's a financial decision at some point. And when you're looking at investments, certainly, it's something you have to look at is the numbers.
Well, my book is sort of targeted at someone who has never owned before, is probably younger, and is scratching their head about this decision. Rates are low, and apartment rents are going up in a lot of markets, so it's a sort of a tipping point for a lot of people to ask themselves if they should own or not. But I've included a chapter in the book about different schools of thought about the degree to which a home is an investment or how it ought to fit into your financial life. And there are a lot of different schools of thought on this. Like, for instance, if you were bought a home and you have a really low interest rate, should you rush to pay that off if you could invest it in stocks, or should you, there's another school of thought that if you're 30 or under, you should not have more than twice your household income and outstanding mortgage, and then that should be zero when you're 60. But then, of course, there are lots of exceptions where that doesn't.
There's as many ideas on that as there are people.
Right.
I am personally of the school of thought if you have borrowing money at 3%, you can invest it at 4 or 5%.
Why would you?
How much would you want?
Right. Exactly.
So,
exactly. So I just think a first-time buyer, maybe focuses a lot on how do I qualify, how do I clean up my credit, and they don't think about how this is going to hit their bigger picture. And that's what's, I think, coming into the conversation more often these days.
Yeah. And the other bigger picture that you talked about is for older people. Right. And whether they're renting or owning at this point in time. And you were just down in South Carolina.
Right.
North Carolina. You're down in the Carolinas.
I was in the South. I was in South Carolina, I was in Alabama, and I was in Georgia. And visiting my father, and also an aging uncle, and working on some of their financial affairs. And it's interesting. You can't really plan what's going to happen, even though you might say, I'm going to, move into this place and stay there a while. It doesn't happen. So I'll tell you a couple examples of that. My father was widowed. My mother died in 2001. He bought a piece of land in North Carolina thinking he would build a house to retire on it. And then he met his next wife. Well, she was widowed in South Carolina. She and her late husband had built a big property on a lake and they'd been there less than 2 years. So my dad moved to South Carolina to live with her, and he let his little piece of land sit there. So, and then everyone has to go to South Carolina to see them, and they've been happy there. But, so these are all decisions.
It's coming from somebody who must know the difference between North Carolina and South Carolina.
Oh, no, it's well, yeah, there's, it's, there's Clemson and there's Tar Heels, but it's just interesting because you make these long-term purchases that have a potential long-term benefit, and you don't actually know what could happen to you in a year or two, and you have to kind of have a preparation for that, or a little plan B or back of the napkin idea.
Well, you do. Part of buying a home, it's that roots and putting, like you said, school districts. It's putting those roots down. When elderly people go through this, as you're talking about, that's a whole different family dynamic, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. My childhood home was in Richmond, Virginia. My father sold that in 2002 after my mom had passed away. He'd had it 30 years, owned it outright, got a nice little chunk of money to take into retirement. And so that was fortunate because he was pretty young at the time, and so he could, put that money to work. The piece of property he bought in North Carolina, on the other hand, he bought it in 2002, didn't develop it. It's in an area where, people like to have second homes or retire, but that piece of land's gone up and down with the market. And I looked at how he'd financed it. It turns out he could have refied and gotten 1.25% off of it and saved a lot of money. Probably should have sold several years ago. And so that's something my sister and I are going to have to sell at some point. And so when you make these purchases that have the long-term effect and you're older, or you haven't disposed of them, someone is going to inherit responsibility for that. And the people who inherit that responsibility may just want to get rid of it and not realize the investment potential it even had. Yeah.
I think the biggest key that people can take from this, though, is it's almost no matter your age, buying or selling property,
right,
it's no longer this short-term 3 to 5 year decision. If you're a first-time home buyer, you got to look further out, and if you're elderly or aging or older and you're looking to buy a house, you got to start looking at how that transfer looks.
Well, it's also interesting because what we have in our current environment is people still have the capacity to buy homes with fairly low down payments, deeply below 20%. And so we're also a mobile society. So if you cross highly leveraged purchase with a low down with highly mobile society, that means people need to be more educated on the impacts of exiting.
People don't have a whole lot of skin in the game.
Right. You got to know, you don't have to have a lot of skin in the game, but you have to understand what could happen if you move on quickly.
Well, Jane, thanks so much for joining us. You're going to come back here in just a couple minutes. Heather's going to join us again. Jane Hodges' book, Rent versus Own, a real estate reality check for navigating booms, busts, and bad advice, comes out next month. My name is Ben Brashen. You're listening to Brashenomics.